Her name was Captain Elena Marlowe, though in the quiet of her own home, she preferred simply Elena. To her neighbors, she was the woman who watered the roses at dawn, moving carefully on a leg that still carried the memory of shrapnel. To her comrades, she was the one who never flinched, never turned away when the sky was lit with fire. And to herself, she was still learning what it meant to be both a soldier and a survivor. The mornings were her sanctuary. Before the hum of traffic or the chatter of voices filled the air, she would stand on her porch, coffee cradled in her hands, and let the silence settle around her. The steam rose, curling against the pale light, and in that fragile stillness, she could almost believe she was far from war, far from the memories that haunted her sleep. The world looked ordinary, even tender, with sparrows darting across the fence and the dew glistening on grass blades. But inside her chest was the heaviness of all she had seen, weightless and unbearable at the same time. Her service began when she was 22. She had joined the Marines out of conviction, perhaps stubbornness, though she always described it as a sense of duty. Her father had been a steelworker, her mother a nurse. Both believed in quiet, steady sacrifice, the kind that left little room for grand speeches. Elena inherited their resolve, but not their silence. She wanted to be present where it mattered, where lives hung by a thread. And so she became an officer, carrying her convictions into battlefields that none of her family could imagine. She remembered the heat first, not of the sun, though it burned relentlessly, but of the armored vest pressing against her body, trapping sweat until every movement felt heavy. She remembered the sound, too, boots grinding against gravel, the metallic echo of weapons clutched too tightly, the endless drone of helicopters slicing across the horizon. War had a smell, sharp and unforgettable. Oil, dust, and something acrid that lingered in the air long after explosions faded. These were the fragments her mind returned to unbidden, like ghosts that refused to sleep. But there were other memories, softer ones, that threaded themselves through the fabric of her service. Laughter breaking out in the mess tent after a long day. The way a shared ration bar could feel like a feast. The quiet solidarity in a nod from a fellow Marine before a mission. She cherished these fragments as though they were fragile glass, knowing they had kept her human when everything else tried to make her steel. Still, the war left its mark. There was the mission when everything went wrong, when her unit was ambushed in a canyon that looked peaceful from a distance. She could still see the sharp angles of the rocks, the shadows deep enough to swallow a man whole. She could hear the deafening crack of gunfire, the metallic tang of blood carried on the wind. She had pulled 3 men to safety that day, each heavier than her own strength should have allowed. Her leg had not survived unscarred, but her spirit, somehow, had refused to break. When she returned home, people saw the uniform before they saw her. They thanked her with words that sounded scripted, offered nods that felt hurried. She accepted it all with a polite smile, though inside she longed for something simpler, recognition not of her service, but of her humanity. What she wanted was to be seen not only as a soldier who had fought, but as a woman who still dreamed, still feared, still loved. She found fragments of that recognition in unexpected places. A child's innocent question, "Does it hurt?" asked as they pointed at her cane. An old woman who pressed her hand into Elena's and whispered, "You came home. That's enough." The soft gaze of her sister, who never demanded stories but always offered a listening ear. Each small gesture grounded her, like threads weaving her back into the fabric of ordinary life. Yet, some nights, when the world was quiet, Elena would sit in her living room and trace the edge of her service medal with trembling fingers. The cool metal carried the weight of both pride and grief. She would close her eyes, and for a moment she was back there. The chaos, the dust, the impossible decisions, and her chest would tighten as if she were carrying it all over again. But then she would breathe, slowly, until the memories loosened their grip. Her beginnings, she realized, were not only in the uniform or the battles. They were in the resilience she had carried into every moment afterward, in the roses she tended with deliberate care, in the friendships she rekindled, in the laughter she allowed herself even when shadows pressed close. She was not defined by what had broken her, but by how she continued to piece herself together. On mornings when the sun rose golden over the horizon, Elena sometimes whispered a quiet promise to herself, to those who never returned, to the world that kept moving forward. It was simple and unadorned, like the life she now chose to live. I am still here. I am still standing. And in that truth, there was both an ending and a beginning. The first time Elena woke drenched in sweat, she thought it was the heat. Summer had always pressed heavy on her shoulders, the kind of air that clung and suffocated. But when her hand brushed the sheets and felt them soaked through, when her pulse raced like it had on the canyon floor years ago, she realized it wasn't the weather at all. The war had followed her home. At night, her dreams unraveled into chaos. She saw the rocks tumbling, heard the cries of men she had dragged through dust, tasted the metallic edge of blood in the back of her throat. She woke gasping, her throat raw, fingers clawing at air that felt too thick to breathe. And when silence finally settled again, she lay still, staring at the ceiling until dawn painted its pale light across the room. The days carried their own battles. Crowded places made her chest tighten. A slammed door could send her heart leaping, the echo of gunfire buried in its sound. Even the simple act of walking down a supermarket aisle sometimes felt impossible. Every stranger's gaze an unspoken question she wasn't ready to answer. She tried to move through it all with composure, but beneath her calm exterior there was a storm no one else could see. Her leg ached often, sharp and insistent, a reminder of the canyon ambush. Some days it was only a dull throb, the kind she could ignore while tending to her roses or folding laundry. Other days it was fire, radiating down to her ankle until each step felt like punishment. The cane helped, but the cane also drew eyes. She caught herself wondering if people saw her as fragile, or if they guessed at the story etched beneath her scars. Yet the hardest struggle was not the pain, nor the sleepless nights. It was the distance. The gulf between who she had been and who she was now seemed impossible to cross. She had once been Captain Marlowe, leader, steady hand in the chaos of war. Now, she was simply Elena, living in a quiet house on a quiet street. But the world around her did not pause to let her catch up. Friends had families, careers, celebrations. She smiled at their photographs, their joy radiant and genuine, but a quiet ache spread in her chest. Where did she fit among them? Some afternoons, she wandered the local park. The air smelled of pine and earth, and children's laughter echoed off the playground slides. She watched them with a bittersweet fondness, recalling how, in another life, she had imagined raising her own family. But war had delayed that dream, perhaps stolen it altogether. She sat on the bench and let the breeze cool her skin, whispering through leaves that flickered sunlight across her face. In those small moments, she felt both part of the world and apart from it. The VA clinic became a routine, though she never loved the sterile smell of its halls. White walls, soft beeps from machines, the shuffle of other veterans waiting their turn. She recognized the look in their eyes, haunted, heavy, searching. Some greeted her with nods, others avoided eye contact altogether. There was a quiet brotherhood in those silences, an acknowledgement that words often failed where scars spoke louder. One day, she found herself in a therapy group. The chairs were arranged in a circle, too neat, too deliberate. She wanted to disappear into the wallpaper, to keep her stories folded tightly inside. But when another veteran, a man barely 30, hands trembling as he spoke, described his fear of sleeping, Elena felt her own defenses falter. She knew that fear. She lived it. And so, haltingly, she spoke. Her words came slow, uncertain at first. She described the canyon, the gunfire, the sound of rocks collapsing like thunder. She described the silence afterward, more unbearable than the noise. The room listened, and in their listening, something shifted. She wasn't just a soldier reliving her nightmares. She was a human being seen, heard, and understood. When she finished, her hands shook, but her chest felt a fraction lighter. The sessions did not erase her struggles, but they carved out small spaces of relief. Each time she spoke, each time she listened, she carried a little less of the weight alone. The healing was not linear. Some nights were worse than before, some mornings heavier, but there was a thread of connection she clung to. It was fragile, yes, but it was real. Still, in the privacy of her home, Elena often returned to the medal she kept tucked in a small wooden box. She would open it, hold it, feel its cool edges press into her palm. The medal was meant to honor sacrifice, yet it also bound her to memories she wished she could release. She would close her eyes, her breath catching as images flickered like old film. And then, slowly, she would set the medal back in its box, close the lid, and whisper, "Not tonight." Her struggle was not just survival, it was learning to let life in again. To allow laughter to rise freely, to savor the taste of morning coffee without bitterness, to greet the sunrise not as a reminder of sleepless nights, but as a promise of another day. It was not easy, and it was not complete, but it was hers. And in the quiet struggle, there was a quiet kind of courage too. It happened quietly, without ceremony. Elena was walking home from the clinic one late afternoon when the sky broke open into a wash of amber and violet. The horizon glowed like fire, not the kind that brought destruction, but the kind that softened the edges of the world. She stopped on the sidewalk, leaning lightly on her cane, and felt the light spill across her face. For the first time in years, she didn't flinch at the brilliance. She simply let it bathe her, warm and unthreatening, as though the sky itself was telling her she was safe. The weeks that followed unfolded with a gentleness she had not expected. Therapy had cracked something open inside her, and though it frightened her to feel vulnerable, it also offered a strange relief. She found herself speaking more little by little at the group sessions, to her sister on the phone, even to the stranger who sold her bread at the market. Words had weight, but when shared, they became lighter, like stones scattered across a river instead of chained to her chest. One morning, she returned to the park where she so often sat in silence. This time, a small group of children were gathered near the benches, their voices bright, their laughter spilling into the air. A boy, no older than 10, approached her with a soccer ball in hand. "Miss, can you play?" he asked, eyes wide, hopeful. She almost said no. Her leg ached, her body tired, but something in his innocence nudged her forward. She smiled faintly. "I can try." They didn't ask for much. She only kicked the ball once, a gentle tap, but the boy grinned as though she had performed a miracle. The sound of their cheers rang in her ears long after she had returned to her bench. And in that sound, she felt the echo of something she thought she had lost, joy without burden, laughter without sorrow. It stirred inside her like an ember finding air. Later, as she walked home, her mind replayed the boy's voice, his unquestioning acceptance. He had seen her cane, her limp, the lines of strain across her face, and still he had invited her into his world, if only for a moment. She realized that healing might not come from forgetting the past, but from stepping into such moments of connection, however small. The turning point deepened when she was asked to speak at a local school on Veterans Day. At first, she hesitated. She had no interest in standing on a stage, no appetite for speeches. But the principal insisted the students needed to hear voices like hers, not stories of medals and victories, but stories of humanity. Reluctantly, she agreed. The day of the assembly, she stood before rows of young faces, her palms damp, her heart hammering against her ribs. For a moment, she wanted to run, to retreat back into the safety of silence. But then she saw them, eager, curious, innocent. And she thought of the boy in the park, the way he had asked her to play, without judgment. She took a deep breath. "I am not here to tell you war is glorious," she began softly. "I am here to tell you that it is costly, that it changes people, that it asks too much." Her voice trembled, but she pressed on. She spoke of sacrifice, of friendship forged in fire, of the weight of decisions no one should have to make. She spoke of loss, but also of resilience, the kind that doesn't roar, but endures. When she finished, the room was silent, not from disinterest, but from reverence. Then, slowly, the applause rose, warm and genuine. Afterward, a girl no older than 16 approached her. "Thank you," she whispered, tears shining in her eyes. "My brother's in the service. I worry about him every day. Hearing you but helps." Elena's throat tightened. She placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "Your worry is love," she said softly. "And love is stronger than fear." That night, she sat by her window, the medal resting on the table beside her. For the first time, she did not hold it with trembling hands. Instead, she let it sit there, gleaming faintly in the lamplight. It was not just a reminder of what she had endured. It was a testament to survival, to the possibility of carrying both grief and hope in the same heart. She realized then that her story was not solely about what she had lost. It was about what she continued to find: the laughter of children, the gratitude of strangers, the warmth of the setting sun. Each piece, small as it was, stitched her life back together. The war would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. What defined her now was the choice to keep moving forward, to rise each morning, to tend her roses, to speak when words were needed, and to sit quietly when silence spoke louder. And in that choice, she found something she had thought impossible: peace, fragile yet enduring, like light breaking through the clouds after a storm. Elena stood at the edge of her garden, her hand resting lightly on the wooden fence. The roses had come into bloom again, their petals unfurling in soft hues of red and ivory, swaying gently in the morning breeze. She bent closer, inhaling their fragrance, letting it ground her. Years ago, she might have overlooked such a moment, simple, quiet, almost fragile. Now she understood its weight. Life was not in the grand gestures, but in the steady unfolding of small mercies. The days had grown steadier, though not without shadows. Some nights still carried echoes of gunfire. Some mornings the ache in her leg returned with sharp insistence. But Elena no longer measured her life by what haunted her. Instead, she measured it by the ways she chose to live despite it. Each day she rose, tended her roses, brewed her coffee, and carried her story with both hands, carefully, but without shame. Her community began to know her differently. At the market, people greeted her not as the veteran but as Elena, the woman who always asked about their children, who recommended the ripest fruit, who offered a smile even when her eyes looked tired. She gave talks occasionally, not out of obligation, but because she had discovered that speaking allowed her to reclaim pieces of herself. Each time she stood before a group, whether of students, neighbors, or fellow veterans, her voice felt steadier, her words more like bridges than confessions. One evening, after a small gathering at the library where she had read a passage from her journal, a man approached her. He was older, his own uniform years behind him, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached out. "You said something tonight," he murmured, "about carrying grief and hope together. I didn't know it was possible, but maybe it is." Elena clasped his hand firmly. "It is," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "We don't have to choose one over the other." That exchange stayed with her. It reminded her of how far she had come, from silence, from isolation, from the weight that once pinned her down. She had not been alone in her struggle, though it had often felt that way. And now, by offering her truth, she could be a light for others. Her sister visited often, bringing her 2 children who filled the house with laughter and noise. Elena found herself enjoying their chaos, the way they darted through the hallways, their joy uncontained. She let them tug her toward the yard, even when her leg protested, even when the world inside her still held scars. Watching them chase fireflies in the dusk, she felt her chest ease. This was what healing looked like, not erasing the past, but allowing the present to grow around it. One late night, unable to sleep, she sat at her window with the medal beside her once more. But this time, she did not trace it with trembling fingers. She looked at it calmly, with a kind of tender distance. It was no longer a chain, no longer a weight pressing her into silence. It was a chapter, closed but never forgotten. She whispered to the empty room, I carry you with me, but you do not define me. And in that whispered truth, she felt the soft release of something long held too tightly. Her reflections deepened in those quiet hours. She thought often of the ones who hadn't returned, the comrades whose laughter had once filled the night, but whose voices were now only echoes. She honored them not with constant grief, but by living in a way they could no longer do. When she placed flowers by the memorial downtown, she did so with reverence, her heart heavy yet open. "You are remembered," she would murmur. "And because of you, I will keep going." As autumn rolled in, Elena began keeping a small journal by her bedside. Each night she wrote a line or two, nothing elaborate, sometimes only a description of the sky, or a sentence about the kindness of a stranger, or the way her roses leaned toward the light. Slowly, the pages filled with fragments of beauty, small reminders that life still offered wonder. Reading them back, she realized they were not just words on paper. They were proof of her resilience, evidence that even in her quietest moments, she was still reaching forward. She understood now that healing was not a destination, but a rhythm. Some days brought calm, others unease. Some mornings she felt whole, others she felt fragile. But in every moment, there was a thread of strength, woven from memory, from love, from the stubborn will to continue. And that thread was enough to hold her together. On the final evening of the year, Elena lit a single candle and placed it on the porch. The night air was cool, the stars sharp against the dark sky. She stood there, her cane by her side, and let the glow of the flame reflect in her eyes. It was not a grand gesture, just a quiet ritual of remembrance and hope. She whispered into the night, her voice steady. "I am still here. I am still standing. And tomorrow I will rise again." In that whisper was not only her truth, but her gift to the world, a reminder that even after the harshest storms, the human spirit can bloom again, fragile and radiant, like roses opening to the morning light. The first snowfall of winter came softly, blanketing Elena's neighborhood in quiet. She stood at her window, watching the flakes drift like scattered feathers, landing on rooftops and tree branches, turning the familiar streets into something hushed and otherworldly. She pressed her palm against the glass, feeling the cold seep faintly through, and let herself marvel at the stillness. There was something about snow that felt cleansing, as though the earth itself was given a chance to rest. Outside, children shouted in delight, their voices muffled by the heavy air as they tumbled into drifts and shaped snow into fragile forts. Elena smiled faintly. She remembered winters spent training, the biting wind cutting across the base, the relentless push forward despite frozen fingers and aching muscles. Those memories carried their own weight, but now they mingled with the sight before her. Joy unburdened, laughter without consequence. She breathed deeply, letting the contrast settle into her heart. The new year had arrived, and with it a subtle shift. Elena felt it most in her mornings, when she rose not only out of habit, but with a quiet sense of purpose. She had begun volunteering at the local community center, helping organize events for veterans and their families. At first, she had doubted herself, worried her voice might falter, that her own struggles would overshadow her efforts. But what she found instead was a space where her honesty mattered, where her presence alone was enough. One afternoon, she sat across from a young woman recently discharged, her eyes wide with the same uncertainty Elena once carried. The woman fidgeted with her hands, her words halting as she tried to explain the heaviness she felt returning to civilian life. Elena listened, not interrupting, not rushing. When the woman's voice broke, Elena reached across the table and gently took her hand. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," Elena said softly. "It's enough to just breathe through today." The woman's shoulders eased, her eyes filling with tears. In that moment, Elena saw her younger self reflected back, a soldier desperate for someone to tell her she wasn't broken, that survival itself was a form of strength. Offering those words felt like stitching something closed, not only for the woman across from her, but for herself. Her garden, too, had become a place of gathering. Though dormant in the cold, it still drew neighbors who paused to chat at her fence, who brought over small gifts of tea or pastries, who asked her advice on how to coax life from stubborn soil. She shared what she knew with patience, delighted when they returned weeks later with news of their own flowers blooming. It was a quiet exchange, but meaningful, proof that growth was never hers alone to carry. There were still difficult days. Sometimes the weight of absence struck her suddenly, walking past the folded flag on her shelf, hearing a song that reminded her of comrades gone, smelling something that carried her back to dust and smoke. On those days, she allowed herself the ache. She did not push it away, nor drown in it. She simply let it exist, acknowledging it as part of her truth. And when the ache softened, as it always did, she returned to the present with steadier breath. One evening, her sister invited her to a family dinner. The house was alive with voices and clinking dishes, with children running underfoot and the smell of bread fresh from the oven. Elena sat at the table, her cane leaning against her chair, and listened as stories flowed around her. She laughed when her niece recounted a school mishap. She leaned in when her sister shared plans for the spring, and she felt, for the first time in years, not as an outsider, but as a thread woven back into the tapestry of family. Later that night, when she returned home, she lit a single candle and placed it by the medal on her shelf. She did not speak this time. She simply sat in the glow, feeling the warmth on her skin, and let gratitude rise quietly in her chest. Not gratitude for the pain she had endured, but for the resilience that had carried her through it, for the connections that now rooted her firmly in the present, for the possibility of tomorrow. Elena knew she would never be entirely free of the past. It was stitched into her body, into her dreams, into the silence between her words. But she no longer sought to escape it. Instead, she carried it forward, carefully, intentionally, like a lantern she could hold without burning. It illuminated not only where she had been, but where she was going. As the snow continued to fall outside her window, she whispered once more the truth she had come to live by. I am still here. I am still standing. And this time, she added a new promise, her voice steady in the quiet room. And I will keep walking forward. The snow thickened, the world hushed beneath its weight, and within that silence, Elena felt something like peace, soft, enduring, and wholly her own. The first hints of spring arrived in whispers, tiny green shoots pressing through the thawing earth, a chorus of sparrows returning to rooftops, the damp scent of rain drifting in through open windows. Elena noticed these changes with a tenderness she hadn't always allowed herself. She moved slowly through her garden, cane in hand, gently brushing aside dead leaves to uncover the beginnings of life beneath. Each bud seemed like a promise, quiet, unassuming, but unbroken. Her mornings had grown into rituals. She rose early, brewed tea, and sat by the window while the world woke around her. Sometimes she wrote in a worn leather journal, its pages uneven with ink smudges and pressed flower petals she had tucked away. Her entries were not elaborate, just fragments of thought, a memory that surfaced, a line about the day's weather, but they anchored her. She had once lived by the rhythm of orders and missions. Now, she lived by the rhythm of her own choosing, and there was a quiet power in that. One afternoon, Elena was invited to speak at the community center. The hall was filled with families, young veterans, and curious neighbors. She stood at the front, her cane resting by her side, and for a moment the words caught in her throat. Faces looked back at her with expectation, but also with kindness. She drew a breath, steady and full, and let her voice find its way. I don't have a grand story of triumph, she began. What I have is a story of surviving, of stumbling, of learning how to live with the weight of what can't be changed. The room quieted, the shuffle of chairs fading into stillness. She spoke not of victories or medals, but of small moments, the friend who held her hand in the dark, the garden that reminded her that things grow again, the strangers who became family through shared silence. She told them about fear, about grief, about nights when she thought the morning might never come. And then she told them about mornings that did come and how that mattered more than anything. When she finished, the applause was not loud but steady, rising like a tide. She saw tears in some eyes, nods of recognition in others. A young boy approached her afterward, clutching his mother's hand. "My dad's a soldier," he said softly. "He's away right now. Can I tell him about you?" Elena knelt slightly, her knees protesting but her smile warm. "Yes," she replied. "Tell him I said thank you. And tell him you're brave, too, for waiting." That evening, back in her quiet home, Elena let the memory settle into her chest. It felt different from the heavy weight she once carried. This was lighter, like a lantern glow, reminding her that sharing her story was no longer about reopening wounds, but about offering light to others. As spring deepened, her garden burst back into color. Tulips lifted their heads, daffodils nodded in the breeze, and the air filled with the hum of bees. Neighbors lingered longer by her gate, sometimes joining her in planting or trimming, their laughter weaving easily with her own. She began hosting small gatherings, tea shared on her porch, chairs pulled close, stories exchanged as the sun dipped low. For the first time in many years, her home felt not only like a shelter but a hearth, alive with warmth. But healing, she knew, was not a straight road. There were nights when dreams dragged her back into shadows, when the silence pressed too thickly against her chest. On those nights, she lit a candle and sat quietly with herself, allowing the darkness its space without surrendering to it. She had learned that healing was not about erasing scars but about living alongside them, letting them speak without letting them rule. One morning, as she walked slowly down the familiar path toward the park, Elena paused beneath an old oak tree. Its branches stretched wide, heavy with new leaves, casting dappled light across her face. She rested her palm against the bark, rough beneath her fingers, and closed her eyes. She thought of all the seasons this tree had weathered, the storms it had endured, the years it had stood unshaken. In that moment, she felt a kinship, herself, like the tree, rooted in earth she had once doubted could hold her. Strong not because she had never bent, but because she had again and still remained. She opened her eyes and continued on, her steps slow but certain. The road ahead was still unknown, but it was hers. And as the morning sun broke through the branches, spilling gold across her path, Elena allowed herself a rare, unguarded smile. She whispered, more to herself than to the world around her. "The hardest part is behind me. The rest I will meet with open hands." And so she walked on, her figure steady against the horizon, carrying not only the memory of what was lost, but the quiet, luminous strength of what remained.